Our webinar today is partnering with law enforcement to better serve DV victims and survivors. Again, our presenter is Angela Keene with the Domestic Violence Service Center of Lancaster County. So Angela, I'm going to turn it over to you. And thank you for being here with us today.
Sure, thanks for having me, Kelly. As Kelly said, my name is Angela Keene. I'm the Community Outreach and Volunteer Coordinator at Domestic Violence Services of Lancaster County. And I have worked just about every position in the field, I think both domestic violence and sexual assault, over the last 22 years since I started as a volunteer. I have had the opportunity to be an advocate both, at a sexual assault and domestic violence program, as well as in a police department. One of my very first paid positions was a part-time position, Stop Violence Against Women funding. And so I was an advocate working in a police department with local law enforcement. And I did that for about 4 years. And then I went to the district attorney's office and I was an advocate in our domestic violence stop unit there for another 3 years while I was in grad school. So I do feel really fortunate to have both the systems-based and the community-based experience, and to have worked and partnered with law enforcement for a number of years, including with our lethality assessment program. And if you're not familiar with that, we'll cover that a little bit. But Pennsylvania has a lethality assessment program that runs statewide. And I have been one of the trainers for the new counties coming on board. So it's an advocate and a police officer who do the training jointly together. And so those are some of the reasons I think why I was asked to put this training together. Please don't hesitate to ask questions along the way. Kelly's going to monitor the chat box for us so that way, because when you're in the share screen mode, it's hard to see the chat box, but she'll be able to see it. I also have a couple of questions along the way that I'll ask you to answer in the chat box, just to keep you engaged and help generate some conversation, and to hear from all of you about some of your experience. So if you are ready to go, we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're going to review DV collaborations with law enforcement that are active in Pennsylvania. We'll define individual and systems advocacy, and then we'll talk about building trust and collaboration with law enforcement, and look at perspective and its role in advocacy work. This is a screen about self-care, and you're probably wondering why, but I have made the commitment in all of my trainings that I do to start with a note about self-care, because the work that we do is incredibly difficult. It taxes us mentally, emotionally, and even physically. If you think about how trauma impacts the body, and how trauma, impacts our experiences. So it's really important for us to continue to be cognizant of self-care. It's an ethical issue. We really need to pay attention to it. If we can't take care of ourselves, then it could have an impact on us taking care of others. And I like this because it's straight and to the point, and it's multidimensional. So you can pick your self-care, whether it's cognitive, whether it's environmental, just finding different ways to take care of yourself. So we know that victims want safety, access. Kelly, I'm having trouble with this box that won't go away. And it's in the middle of my screen. It's the one where the waiting keeps coming up.
Yeah. Does it come up again if you advance the slide again?
I see the waiting room, and then I see how many people are coming in. And it doesn't go away.
The only thing that I see is please move this window away.
Yeah, what is that?
Do you have a box open on top of your slides on your screen?
No.
I've actually never seen that before. Maybe if you just
Okay,
want to
then
take a moment and stop sharing and then
that's
reshare
what I'm
your
thinking.
screen.
Try again.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've never seen that before.
Sorry, everybody.
One of those technical difficulties. If you
Yep,
just give
it's
us a
one of
minute,
those
please.
tech things.
We love our technology, but when it acts up, we don't love it so much.
Right. Okay. So we know, from research and even from our own personal or professional experiences, that victims want safety. They want to live in a community that's safe. They want to be free of crime. They want access to the justice system. They want access to the information. They want information in a timely fashion. They want to stay informed of, most of the time they want to stay informed of their cases. This is not across the board. There are some victims who completely disengage, and that's okay too. But victims, want information. They want it in a user-friendly sort of way. So that's going to include the language that we use. Victims want support. And that's oftentimes where, advocates come in and the work that we do. They want continuity. So if they are, working with one agency or one person, a warm handoff is pretty much how I take away the continuity. Let's make sure that they understand who's going to work with them, why they're going to work with them, what their role is, make those introductions, give that warm handoff. Victims also want voice. They want to have a say in what happens. They want to have a say in what the outcome might be, and they want justice. And sometimes that, the justice isn't necessarily what they had envisioned, but having a voice will sometimes meet that need. We know that justice can be defined in lots of different ways, and oftentimes, victims may need to look for justice in other ways, like restorative justice, outcomes, or opportunities. So the domestic violence collaborations that currently exist in Pennsylvania, I hope that I've got them, but if I missed something, please call it out in the chat box so that the rest of us can learn about what some of those other collaborations might be, especially in your counties. We know, so there's still Stop Violence Against Women funding in Pennsylvania. STOP stands for Services, Training, Officers, and Prosecutors. And that legislation is more than 20 years old because the purpose is really to bring together those groups, to bring together officers, prosecutors, and advocates to collaborate on services and to create coordinated continuum of care for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, etc. And so it's really important for us to recognize that these roots run deep in Pennsylvania. I think Lancaster was one of the first pilot counties in 1996 or 1997. So it's been here for a really long time. And it's important for us to continue to advocate for it. It's another way that we advocate, right? For legislation. So we have STOP counties that are happening, STOP money that's in Pennsylvania. Another opportunity to advocate and to collaborate with law enforcement is through the Lethality Assessment Program that I mentioned earlier. In Pennsylvania, the program started in 2012 with 11 county partnerships. So when I worked at the Gettysburg program at that time, we were actually one of the pilot sites, and we partnered with the local Gettysburg Borough Police Department as one of the partnerships to be included in the pilot programming. And now we have more than half of the Pennsylvania counties that are on board. I used the slide for another training that I did. Lancaster came on board in 2016, and we have 14 police departments. The protocol is actually run out of the district attorney's office. So there's a couple of ways that this happens. When I was in Adams County, the district attorney's office wasn't involved, and they said that we could do it department by department. So I was recruiting local municipal departments to partner with us for lethality assessment and then doing the training and everything with them. Here in Lancaster, there's a more centrally located coordination effort happening out of the district attorney's office. And so it's part of our domestic violence protocol, the countywide protocol that we have, to include the lethality assessment screening. And then obviously our agency has an internal protocol for handling those calls. So lethality assessment is another way to collaborate. If you don't know about lethality assessment, you should contact PCADV. Lois Fosnock is the coordinator of the program there. And I have another screener too, one of those that is on board. And you're interested in doing that, you can talk with her. This is from the PCADV website. There's currently 47 domestic violence programs serving 49 counties with 360 local law enforcement agencies who are participating in lethality assessment. And then this is just what the screening tool looks like, and the factors that we look at when we talk about lethality assessment. Strangulation is on there, except that the question is, has he or she ever tried to choke you? So choking is when, you know, you choke on a grape or something, but strangulation is that outside pressure. When you look at these lethality factors, and I'm getting to some of the research here, you can see that the only physical form of, the actual physical form of violence is strangulation. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. The rest is a lot of jealousy, controlling behavior, threats, weapons, and stalking behavior. So here's what we know. In the description, I included some research. 28 to 33% of victims, the first incident of violence was the homicide. And so in 83% of the near homicide cases, the forms of violence were jealousy, controlling behavior, stalking behavior. This is an important statistic because sometimes we've been taught, when I started in the field over 20 years ago, you know, the theory was that the violence escalates, right? It starts off with maybe some non-physical things, and then it gets increasingly physical, and the physical violence gets increasingly worse. And that's not necessarily the case according to all of this research, that the first incident of physical violence was actually the homicide in about a third of the cases. So we have to keep that in mind, that the jealousy and the controlling behavior is equally as important red flag. More than 44% of perpetrators were arrested in the year prior to the homicide. That's an opportunity or a missed opportunity. So we know that there's contact with law enforcement and the criminal justice system, and that might be an opportunity to do some lethality risk assessment. So there's another opportunity to interact with law enforcement and to collaborate with law enforcement through your probation and parole departments, the local probation and parole departments. So do they have a domestic violence unit there? Do they have people who are specifically supervising domestic violence offenders? What is the role of the victim there? Are they doing any risk assessment with victims? You know, do they interview the victims at all to learn more about the offender? You know, those are still considered law enforcement collaborations. And that would be something that you would be able to talk with your local department about. The other piece of research, and this was the one that really sold me on the program, and I was continue to be shocked by, only 4% of abuse victims had used the DV services in the year prior to being killed by an intimate partner. And what that said, like, how is it possible that all of those people don't know that we have these free and confidential services, right? Everybody knows where the shelter is. So that was really shocking to me, but also, again, according to the research, it's a missed opportunity because we know that people are going to law enforcement. Victims are calling law enforcement for whatever it might be. It might be a verbal altercation. It might be a family situation, but we know that they're calling law enforcement, even if they're not reaching out to us. And so this partnership really helps law enforcement to know what to do. It gives them a tool, a screening tool that they can use. It's research-based, so it's evidence-based. They're using this tool to better assess the system, the situation with the victim, and then to also make that warm handoff to us on the hotline when they're still with them. It's a perfect example of collaboration, but we also have to be on our end. We have to be consistent. We have to, be quick about it, because it's not a counseling session, right? So ultimately, what we know is that if it's predictable, then hopefully it's preventable, and that's what the research tells us here. All of this comes out of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence and their work with Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. In Pennsylvania, we know from the homicide reports, if you know anything about PCADV, they put out an annual homicide report. They collect that information every year, and you can also get that information on their website. So we know, again, that it's preventable, and that we can do this work, but we have to do it in collaboration with law enforcement and our systems partners, because as the statistics tell us, their victims aren't always automatically reaching out to us. They might first be contacting law enforcement or be involved in the criminal justice system first. So I also am working very hard to help create change in language, avoiding that question, why doesn't she just leave? And with the folks I talk to, we talk more about leaving is not always safer, but safer is safer. And I think that I heard that somewhere in a training before, so I can't own that totally as mine. But we know that sometimes leaving is not the best option. So that's the kind of some of the research. If anybody has any other local collaborations that they're doing, please don't hesitate to share that in the chat box, because we definitely want to highlight that and, share those ideas, because that's how we figure out how to continue to change systems. So individual advocacy, in the chat box, if you could tell us how you would define individual advocacy, or what you think it is, or describe it to us in some way. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to do that and ask Kelly to let me know what y'all write.
And actually, while you're typing in your responses, I am going to go ahead and launch the first of the chat boxes, or I'm sorry, the poll boxes for CLE credits. Attorneys, if you could please click yes or no. The poll will be up for 1 minute. And nobody's going to write any responses in this chat box? I don't see anything so far. Okay, here we have some responses. Angela, we have advocating, whoops, they're coming in at once, I'm sorry. Advocating based on individual needs of client, advocacy based on the individual that you're servicing. I think of supporting survivors in identifying their goals and then working towards them with other systems, working with an individual instead of a group, ? Helping survivors triage their needs and matching them with resources / legal options accordingly, and working on behalf of individual needs. Individual advocacy is dependent on each client's background and set of facts. Wraparound kind of services, helping a client with intervention with employers or landlords or creditors. And our less common is giving client agency and voice.
Great. Great. So it sounds like we all have a general understanding of individual advocacy. I summarize it as supporting individuals to exercise their rights, to figure out what they need and how to accomplish those needs. So we're there to help voice their concerns. We're there to help them accessing information. If there are issues that need to be resolved, we can be there as a voice for them. Sorry about that. We can be there to help connect them to the resources or the people who can help resolve issues, and also to help them identify other supports in the community. because we want them to have a full range of access to services in the community. There are two types of advocates, and I think it's important for us to take a minute to talk about that, because there's, especially when it comes to confidentiality, but our roles are different. So we have systems-based advocates, and those advocates generally work within criminal justice agencies. They're there to fulfill victims' rights. There's an impact on confidentiality, right? So they have a more limited scope of confidentiality than those of us who are working in domestic violence and sexual assault programs. Community-based advocates are those of us who are working outside of the system. I mean, we work in partnership with the system, but really, you know, we're working in domestic violence and sexual assault agencies in the community for the most part. And so in our work, it may be specific to the population of victims our agency serves. In Lancaster, we are separate centers, so I'm working more specifically with domestic violence survivors, although we do partner well with our local sexual assault program here. We do have, you know, that confidentiality privilege through the PFA Act that is pretty strict and pretty strong. And it also gives us an opportunity when we're not within the system, when we're outside of the system, to look for new partnerships and to think outside of the box when we're advocating within the community for systems change. Confidentiality is important, and these are one of the things that can sometimes get in the way of our relationships with law enforcement. And in my experience, it's been really because they don't understand. And so it's important to have those conversations. Confidentiality is absolute if you're working, you know, if you fall under a domestic violence or sexual assault program and you have the appropriate training and credentials. Explaining that and being able to explain that to our law enforcement peers is sometimes challenging. And so it's important for us to also let them know that just because, you know, the confidentiality privilege runs with the victim, right? So it's their privilege with us. And that they can also, that victims have that opportunity, our clients have the opportunity to give us some release from that. If they want us to be able to coordinate and collaborate with others in the system or other community partners. We all have those releases of information that we know very well. And so so it's important, I think, if you have the conversation with law enforcement to help them understand, so that way they know that we're not, you know, we're not trying to hide anything, we're not trying to block anybody or anything, but that it's an empowerment tool that's available to us when we're working with victims. And so having those conversations early on and in advance before it becomes a problem is often really helpful as you're building those relationships with your peers. Systems advocacy, I'm going to skip over the question here, but systems advocacy here is really about identifying what the needs are in the community, who is impacted by those needs, what resources are available in the community, how can we collaborate, right? So systems advocacy is creating a broader level, community level, systems level change that will hopefully be fruitful for victims to help navigate their way through understand. So systems to better serve crime victims. It's also an opportunity to identify gaps in services and then explore ways to fill those gaps. It's an opportunity to use our best practices and research, and we're working at multiple levels at the systems level, from local initiatives to statewide and federal legislative initiatives. And we always want to make sure that we keep the issues and experiences of victims at the center of our work, because we're trying to create these systems and structural changes that ultimately benefit them. And so if everybody who's at the table shares that same focus, that this is an opportunity for us to create a better way for victims to have voice, to feel safe in the community, to find justice. If we all have that shared goal kind of at the center of the wheel, then hopefully that helps to bring us together. And that's the first step is we all need to be on the same page or working towards the same goal. So systems advocacy is a higher level and equally as important as the individual advocacy work. Oftentimes you may be doing both. Depending on your role, you may be doing one or the other, but oftentimes they work in tandem together. For systems advocacy, it's a matter of perspective, the way someone looks at something, and that we also need to be open to other people's perspectives and their experiences. It doesn't mean that we have to adopt it, but that people want to be heard, right? When we're talking about relationship building, it's about open communication and being heard. So listening to other people's perspective, respecting the other person or the other, party, the other organization, respecting the perspective that they have and the responsibilities. We're all puzzle pieces in this, community model of advocacy. And so we all have to fit together somehow. So being open to those multiple points of view and being willing to compromise and collaborate. So we're going to talk a little bit more about trust and collaboration. There is a great Brene Brown video. Disclaimer, I'm a huge Brene Brown fan. And if she ever comes near Lancaster, I'm going to go see her in person. I use some of her videos and some other trainings and teaching that I do. And she has this one that looks like it's fairly new. It's the anatomy of trust. And on my last slide, I have some resources listed. But if you Google anatomy of trust or braving with Brene Brown, you should find it. It looks something, it'll come up in this. I don't know what Oprah's SuperSoul Conversations are, but it must be a series that she's running, and Brene Brown is part of that. So what does braving stand for? That's the acronym that she's using for this anatomy of trust. Boundaries. Ooh. Uh-oh.
What's wrong?
Sorry, it looks like it's pulling up the video.
Oh.
I don't know why it did that.
Oh, I
Okay.
see your slide.
We just don't have time to watch the video. Sorry. Go ahead, Kelly.
I'm sorry. All I see is your slide.
Do you see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay. It must have, the video's embedded. Anyway, the video is about 20 minutes long, I think. So if you have time, take a look at it. She starts by talking about a jar of marbles, which is always very interesting and enticing when something so ambiguous is tied to the work that we do. So she's using this braving acronym to talk about boundaries, that we all need to have established boundaries, and that people need to respect each other's boundaries in order to build that trust. Reliability, that we need to do what we're going to say we're going to do. We need to follow through. And let me tell you, this is incredibly important with law enforcement. Even if it's as simple as following up to give an officer a number, to drop off your pamphlets or brochures or hotline cards or information so that they have that information to hand out or have available in their department. If you say that you're going to do something, please follow through. That's incredibly important with law enforcement. Accountability. So, if I screw up, I have to own it and make amends for that. And to, we all do that, or we all forget to do something or something got in the way. So holding ourselves accountable. The vault. So that is about holding confidence. And if you have the opportunity to have those one-on-one conversations with law enforcement, they might, talk to you about their frustration with a situation. And you have to be able to hold that and also not judge. That's the end when we get there. But to be non-judgmental. Sometimes law enforcement really just don't know what to do or how to do something. And they might be looking for some feedback, but not to feel bad about how they handled the situation. I will tell you that in my experience, the one-to-one conversations had the greatest impact on the law enforcement officers that I worked with, whether I was in the police department or at the DA's office. I would get to talk to law enforcement at preliminary hearings and things like that. And just having one-to-one conversations with people and building that rapport, you know, giving them an opportunity to air some of their frustration, and then, you know, sharing my experience about that. So the whole "why doesn't she just leave" question, you know, there's lots of reasons why they don't leave, you know, and having that one-on-one conversation in a gentle way that doesn't feel like they're being judged, right? So that's where I think, you know, a lot of the work comes in, is that one-to-one. And that's considered individual advocacy too, right? So we're not always just advocating for a client, but sometimes we're working at that individual level to change systems, to change the way people think, to educate people about the issue. Integrity. So sometimes we have to choose courage over comfort. And sometimes we have to, it's not always the fun or easy thing, but that it's the right thing to do. And so that's, you know, carefully choosing the conversations that we're going to have, and how we might say something, which I think ties into, you know, the vault and also the non-judgmental, being able to, you know, gently talk with someone about, you know, again, that "why doesn't she just leave" question. I think that that's one of the places where we can have some of those conversations. And it may be a differing point of view than they might have, but if you're talking from your experience, and the experiential knowledge that you have, that can also be helpful in those conversations. And then just being generous and assuming the most out of the best and most out of people, and also knowing that you're offering your best and your most to them. So take a look at the video if you have time. It's really good. Um, so it's important when we're building trust that to take time. And sometimes it might be informal ways of having those conversations, before or after a meeting. Having, you know, maybe you're waiting for trial or something like that. If you can go and get coffee or something, and just have some informal conversation. Trust building comes through the relationships. You know, my experience with law enforcement is that they want to know that I'm a real person and that I'm not going to judge them. And I've seen it happen. I've seen law enforcement who absolutely refuse to work with certain people because they feel like they're always going to get a lecture. They feel like they're always going to be judged. They feel like they're always going to be told what they did wrong, or something that they could do better. They don't want to hear that. Domestic violence cases are very hard on law enforcement. Most of the time they get it right, sometimes they don't. And some of them really do care a lot and feel the anguish that we do when we want to help somebody, but maybe they're not ready for it, or, you know, the help is offered and they're just not interested. So, you know, they have some of those similar frustrations. They don't want to be lectured about it. So that's why we have to find other ways to have some of those conversations. And sometimes that means that you have to share something about yourself or your experience, or a question or a doubt or something that you have, to open up that connection. One-to-one situations are great. And if you have the opportunity for those conversations, then take advantage of it. I mentioned before, following through, making sure that you say that you're gonna do what you say you're gonna do, and being transparent. You know, this work is frustrating for me sometimes too. You know, it's hard on all of us. And letting them see that you're a real person too. We don't have to disparage, you know, anybody by saying this work is hard, and making that connection with somebody else. So how do we build trust with law enforcement? I took this graphic from a work. It's on the resources page. It's got a long title, but it's a collaborating toolkit. that focuses more specifically on law enforcement and communities. So there's an action plan, so that's putting together, if you're doing especially the systems advocacy work, having the group put together a plan, finding the means that are sufficient to fulfill the goals within the plan, having partners who are motivated. There's that open communication, and developing trust, right? That's part of our open communication. Developing a teamwork frame of mind and strategies that will help you move the group towards a successful action plan. Having the right expertise in the room and at the table. It's also important when you're talking about collaborating to have a shared vision and common goal. That's what's going to move the action plan forward. And then having invested stakeholders. If you can do all of this and build trust, then you'll have those successful collaborations at all levels that will hopefully move the systems forward to better serve the clients you work with. But you can see here that trust is at the center of the wheel. Collaboration also includes a common vision. So some questions to ask yourself, and maybe your group, if you're part of a group who's doing this work. What perceptions do we have of each other? This could get interesting. If you ask the question, there's the stereotypical, law enforcement don't care, they're tough guys, they're there to just do a job, and they might think that victim advocates are, soft and holding tissues and crying with the victims, right? We know that that's not true. But those might be some of the perceptions or rooted perceptions, honestly, that we have of each other. So you have to talk that out, put it on the table. Where do these perceptions have their origin? How did they get here? Are they myth or fact? And then what's in the best interest of both of our organizations to achieve? So we all have the shared goal of providing the best service to victims that we can, with a continuum of care that includes that continuity that we talked about at the beginning. So how do we do that? How can we work together to create that? What can we agree upon? And then what are the responsibilities that each of our agencies or organizations have for solving problems? So these are some questions that you can use if you're trying to work together with another agency, with law enforcement. It might be interesting. Some of this, like the perceptions, that could be an interesting maybe icebreaker conversation or something like that at a meeting, just to, really kind of get at the root of what's going on, but also, you could term it in a way that, like what are the historical perceptions that our professions have of one another. So maybe not to personalize it so much, but, like what does law enforcement think of advocates? What do advocates think of law enforcement? And that could bring in a different layer of connection when you're talking about these historical notions, and then really, getting down to the root of, is this really what we believe? Is this our paradigm now? And if it is, then where do we need to be? Which ties into building common ground. So you want to make sure that you have everybody invited to the table who's going to be affected by your program or the solution or the process that you're working on. You want, obviously, to have all of those who are going to be impacted by the outcome to have a part in the process and a part in the conversation. And that's important because we know that people, when you have a say in what's going to happen or what the outcome is going to be, you're more invested. And we know that working with clients, we know that for ourselves when we're making family decisions, we know that in our agencies, and it's no different at the systems level. And again, remember that we all have this common goal, and that's providing a caring and safe community that supports victims. Law enforcement recognizes that if victims have what they need, and if they have the support that they need, that hopefully they won't get called back to that location or to that situation again. So it's not that they don't want to see victims move forward. Sometimes they just don't know what the resources are, how to connect to those resources, or how to encourage victims to take advantage of those resources that are available. Domestic violence calls are typically the most dangerous situations for law enforcement. So again, they have motivation for not wanting to return for repeat calls. So it's a matter of letting them know what we can do for them, how we can make their jobs easier. That's some of what the lethality assessment protocol has helped with, that they know that when they call us, we're going to do a targeted safety plan. It's you know, a plan that's just probably good for 24 or 48 hours. Like, we're assessing the immediate situation, but it's important that they know that obviously we're there, that we're reliable, and that we can help them. And even when victims don't choose to speak with us, we can do a safety plan through the officer for the victim. So they're also getting some education and learning some new tools or some tips that they can give to other victims down the road. So having some kind of solid collaboration like that with the warm handoff, and we always thank the officer for calling and taking the time, you know, like, it's important to do that. Even if it's a matter of protocol, it's important that they know that we're appreciative of their individual effort. So this ties into being the resource for law enforcement. How can we make their job easier? If you can make that case for somebody, it's going to take you a longer way with them. They don't want added procedures. They don't want added steps to what they're already doing. They want to be able to work with people who are going to make things a little easier for them, and also keep the victim safe, right? It's important for the collaborative process to also understand and respect the hierarchy and the chain of command. So if you're talking with a police officer and they say that's not my pay grade, go talk to the LT, the lieutenant, to understand why they might be passing you on, because it is a hierarchy and it is important. I mean, they're trained to stay in their lane. So it's important to also know who those key players are, because maybe having a line officer at your meeting is not what you need when you need a sergeant or a lieutenant, or having those conversations. Just really letting know law enforcement that we're here to help and that we care about the work that they're doing. And, if you have an opportunity to thank them at some point, again, for taking the time or extra care, a thank you goes a long way. So perspective is really important when we're talking about making changes and collaborating with other people. So in the chat box, I would like you to identify what you see on the tree stump. There's a tree stump in the middle of that green, and there's something on top of it. What is it? Kelly, can you tell me what they're typing?
Sure. You go up. There's so many responses. It just keeps moving on me. Okay.
It's going to be one of two things.
I got an absolutely, parrot, a bird, parakeet, a red bird, a woman dressed as a parrot, a red parrot, a person painted as a bird, parrot,
Okay.
a bird, parrot,
You're
parrot.
good. Right? So this is, like the old lady, young lady, those optical illusion type things. I came upon this a couple years ago and really like it. So this is actually a model painted as a parrot. And you can actually Google this image and you can see the various stages of this person being painted. But if you look at it one way, you can see the beak over here. And here's the parrot's eye, and it's kind of a profile view. They're looking in this direction. This is a wing. This is their tail. But if you're looking at the person, this is actually their wrist and hand. This is the person's face. Here's the nose, the chin. Their eyes are closed, and they're looking in facing this direction. This is a shoulder, an arm down into a hand, which is the claw of the parrot. And then this is the leg. the front leg, and then back here's the back leg with a pointed toe for the tail. So it's interesting how we can often see the same thing in different ways, right? So that's why it's important to have conversations about perspective and about positions versus interests. So the way we say we get things done, there's lots of things under the surface versus the way we really get things done, right? So are there historical things that have stood in the way or that are part of the way that we get things done? Is the bar set too high? Some people might say, you know, if it's not broke, why fix it? You know, let it go. Or people might put up the roadblock and say that won't work here. So it's important for us to understand why somebody might have a particular position on something that there's an underlying interest for. So when we're talking about conflict resolution or relationship building in general, we have to identify the interests of each of the persons or the organizations who are at the table and part of the conversation. And then shifting from positions to interests is crucial because it helps us to identify the solutions that are going to be acceptable for each of those people or organizations who are part of the conversation. So how do we explain that? Positions are statements or demands that are framed as solutions. So the example might be here is I need a $30,000 salary. So there's a specific outcome, but there may not, that's not necessarily a complete picture, right? Like all we know is what this person's demand or outcome might be, what their bottom line is, but we don't understand why. So the interest is the underlying why. What are their wants? What are their needs, their hopes, their fears? What's motivating them? It gives us an idea about what the broader position, what broader than the position might be. So if the issues that might underlie the $30,000 salary demand might be a lifestyle change. Maybe they have children now and they have childcare costs. Maybe they are now single and supporting themselves where they were once a two-income household. They're looking for career advancement. Maybe they just feel like $30,000 isn't enough for their effort. So what are the interests that underlie the position statement that they're making? This can be really important when we're negotiating and learning about our peers and our community partners. And so basically, I really appreciate this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. People fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. And so this really speaks to the importance of open communication, collaboration, and really that relationship building to come together and to talk about shared experiences, different experiences, but how are we going to use all of that to move forward in the best interest of the victims and survivors we serve. And here are some of the resources that I said that I had listed. Obviously, I listed our agency, the PA Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and also the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence Lethality Assessment Program. There's Brene Brown, Anatomy of Trust, and if you Google that, you should get the video. And then the International Association of Chiefs of Police is a great resource. They also have special protocols there for domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking. So if you're trying to get kind of an inside view, or you're looking, you find something there, that might be a good way to open up some communication with local law enforcement. Hey, I saw this, is this something that you guys have talked about? Have you seen this resource before? What do you think? That might open some doors to conversation. And then there's this long toolkit that I've included. It's a PDF download. It's about 60 pages, I think. But there's some good information in there as well. So I think we have about 5 minutes for questions or comments or however you do this, Kelly.
Okay, while we give people a few minutes to type in any questions or comments they have, I'm going to launch the second poll question box for CLE credits. attorneys that are participating, please respond yes or no. And anybody else, it won't hurt if you respond, but you don't need to. And any questions or comments you have for Angela, please type in the chat box now. And we'll just give it a minute for anybody that may be typing right now. Sometimes people are full of questions and sometimes we don't have so many, so we'll see how it goes. And I am not seeing any questions or comments come up. Oh, you got a thank you, Angela. Very well done.
Yeah, I pulled up the chat box. Thanks,
Okay.
Joseph.
Anybody else with any questions or comments for Angela? Type them in now. Yep, I got
Hey,
another.
Krista.
It's not looking like we have any questions today. So that means you answered all questions and it was an amazing presentation.
Thanks so much. So if anybody has any questions, I forgot to put my own email address up here. It's akeen@caplink.org. Kelly has it, and you can also find me through Domestic Violence Services of Lancaster. So, and you can follow us online. We have our virtual gala this weekend if anybody's interested in a wine pool or a trip to Florida or virtual cooking lessons from around the world. Just throwing that out there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Angela.
Sure, thank you.
Take care and everybody have a great afternoon.